Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. Let me back up. I work in telecommunications, and I had been offered a 6-month contract overseas that would basically set me up financially for years. The pay was incredible, but it meant leaving my house empty for half a year. I live in a pretty decent suburb where the lots are a good size and the neighbors mostly keep to themselves. Well, most of them anyway. My next-door neighbor, who I will call Karen because that name just fits her perfectly, had been living there for about 3 years when this all went down. She was one of those neighbors who always had to have the best of everything. New car every year, lawn that looked like a golf course, holiday decorations that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She was also the type who would find something to complain about if you left your trash cans out an hour too long after pickup. We had never been friends, but we had never really fought either. Just the usual neighbor stuff like her mentioning that my grass was getting a bit long or asking if I could trim the tree branch that was hanging slightly over the property line. Annoying, but not worth starting a war over. Before I left for my contract, Karen had mentioned she was planning some backyard improvements. I remember getting a text from her while I was packing that said something about doing some upgrades to make her space more functional. I just replied that it sounded nice and to enjoy it. I figured maybe she was putting in a new patio or getting a hot tub. Rich people stuff, you know. The flight back home was brutal. 15 hours with 2 connections and I was completely wiped out. All I wanted was to get inside, order some takeout, and sleep for about 12 hours. The airport shuttle dropped me off right in front of my house around 6 in the evening, and I was so focused on just getting my bags that I almost missed it. There was something new in Karen's backyard. At first, I thought maybe I was seeing things because of the jet lag. But no, there it was. What looked like a small building sitting right up against the property line. Not just any building either. This thing was nice. Really nice. I stood there on my front lawn with my suitcase, just staring. The structure was maybe 12 by 15 feet, painted to match Karen's house perfectly, with actual windows that had flower boxes underneath them. There was even electrical conduit running from her house to the building. This was not some cheap storage shed you buy at the home improvement store and throw up in a weekend. This was a custom-built structure that probably cost more than my car. But here is the thing that made my blood pressure spike even through the exhaustion. The property line between our lots is pretty easy to figure out if you know what to look for. When the neighborhood was developed, they put in surveyor pins at the corners, and even though they are old and a bit rusted, they are still there. I had checked them when I bought my house because I wanted to know exactly where my property ended. From where I was standing, it was obvious that part of Karen's fancy new building was not on Karen's property. I dropped my bags and walked over to get a closer look. Sure enough, there was the old surveyor pin, and Karen's building was sitting on a thick concrete foundation that extended a good 5 feet past it onto my land. This was not a case of being a few inches off. This was a significant chunk of an expensive structure built on property that belonged to me. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures from every angle I could think of. The surveyor pin, the building, the foundation, everything. I wanted documentation before I did anything else because I had a feeling this was not going to be a simple conversation. After I got my bags inside and had a chance to think about it for a few minutes, I decided to go talk to Karen. I was tired and annoyed, but I figured maybe she genuinely did not realize the mistake. Maybe her contractor messed up the measurements or something. People make errors, right? I walked over and knocked on her door. When she answered, her face lit up like she had been waiting to show someone her new project. She immediately started talking about how excited she was about her new studio space and how she was going to use it to run her online business selling handmade crafts. She went on about the windows and the electrical work and how she had picked out the perfect paint color to match the house. She was practically glowing with pride. When she finally paused for breath, I told her the building looked really nice, but there was a problem. I explained that part of it appeared to be built on my property and that she would need to move it. The change in her expression was something else. The pride and excitement just vanished, replaced by this look like I had slapped her. She actually scoffed and told me not to be ridiculous, that her contractor had measured everything perfectly and the building was exactly where it was supposed to be. I explained about the surveyor pin and how I could clearly see that the foundation extended onto my land. I tried to stay calm and reasonable, suggesting we could figure out a solution together. That is when she really let me have it. She told me I was being dramatic over a few inches of grass that I did not even use anyway. She said the building looked better where it was and that I was being a bad neighbor for even bringing it up. Then she basically dismissed me and closed the door in my face. I stood there for a minute, trying to process what had just happened. This woman had built a structure on my property without permission, and when I pointed it out, she acted like I was the one being unreasonable. The audacity was breathtaking. I went back to my house and spent the evening looking up property law online. What I learned was not encouraging for Karen. Encroachment, which is what this was called, is a serious legal issue. Property owners have the right to exclusive use of their land, and building on someone else's property without permission can result in being forced to remove the structure entirely. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a property surveyor who could do a rush job for extra money. The second was to a real estate attorney who specialized in boundary disputes. The surveyor came out that afternoon and did a complete survey of both properties. He marked everything with bright pink flags that were visible from space. When he was done, there was no question about where the property line was located. Karen's building was encroaching on my land by exactly 5 feet along the entire 15-foot length of the structure. That meant 75 square feet of her expensive building was sitting on my property. Karen came outside while the surveyor was working and started yelling at him about trespassing and being paid off by me to lie about the measurements. The surveyor, who was a total professional, just ignored her and finished his work. When he handed me the certified survey map, Karen stormed back into her house and slammed the door. I took the survey results to my lawyer the next day. He looked everything over and said I had a very straightforward case. Karen would have to remove the encroaching portion of the building or negotiate some kind of agreement for the use of my land. The lawyer drafted a formal letter that laid out the situation and gave Karen 2 options. She had 14 days to decide what she wanted to do. Option 1 was demolition. Since the building was constructed as a single structure on one foundation, the entire thing would have to be torn down and rebuilt on her own property. She would be responsible for hiring licensed contractors to demolish the building, remove the concrete foundation from my land, and restore that section of my property to its original condition with new topsoil and grass. Option 2 was to lease the land from me. Now, here is where my lawyer got creative. He suggested setting the lease payment at $500 per month. When I asked if that seemed high for 75 square feet of grass, he explained that this was not just about the land. First, the structure violated the city's setback requirements. Buildings have to be at least 10 feet from property lines, and Karen's was sitting right on it. By allowing her to lease the land, I would be taking on legal liability for that violation. The monthly fee included compensation for that risk. Second, this was not just empty land anymore. It was land with a permanent structure that increased its value. The lawyer called it premium utility land rather than just grass. Third, Karen had created this problem herself by not doing proper due diligence before building. The high lease rate reflected the unusual circumstances and the inconvenience to me. Karen received the letter and called me within an hour. She was absolutely furious, screaming that this was extortion and that no judge would ever enforce such an agreement. She said I was trying to steal money from her and that she was going to fight this. I stayed calm and told her she might be right about the judge not agreeing to the lease terms. But the judge would definitely agree with the certified survey, and they would not offer her a lease option. They would just order her to demolish the building. I reminded her that she had 12 days left to decide. What happened next was the best part of this whole mess. Karen was so convinced that I was bluffing and that the whole thing was some kind of scam that she decided to call the city code enforcement office to report me for harassment. The code enforcement officer came out the next day to investigate. He took one look at the survey markers in the building and immediately wrote Karen a notice of violation for the setback requirements. She had 30 days to remedy the violation, or the city would start fining her $100 per day until it was fixed. When Karen asked the officer what would happen if I gave her permission to use the land, he told her that was a civil matter between neighbors. But if she had a legal document like a lease agreement that gave her rights to the land, she could apply for a variance that might allow the building to stay. Suddenly, my lawyer's lease option went from seeming like extortion to being Karen's only way out of daily fines and a forced demolition. On day 13, I got an email from Karen saying she would sign the lease. My lawyer put together an agreement that covered every possible scenario. It was a 5-year lease that automatically renewed unless I chose to terminate it. Karen did not have the right to end the lease early, but I could terminate it at any time with 60 days' notice. The monthly rent was $500 with a 5% increase each year. Karen was responsible for all maintenance, insurance, and any city fines related to the structure. If she failed to pay rent or violated any terms of the lease, I could evict her and require removal of the building. The lease also specified that the land could only be used for the existing structure and that any modifications would require my written approval. Karen could not sublease the space or use it for any commercial activities beyond her personal crafting business. Karen signed the lease agreement at a notary's office with the most sour expression I have ever seen on another human being. She barely spoke during the entire process and handed over the first month's rent like it physically hurt her to do it. That was 2 years ago now. Karen and I do not talk anymore except when necessary. I see her using the building sometimes, but I have noticed that she does not seem to enjoy it the way she did at first. Maybe knowing that she is paying me to use it takes some of the fun out of it. The financial arrangement has worked out better than I could have imagined. My annual property taxes are $5,900. Karen's rent is $6,000 per year, which means her mistake is essentially paying my property taxes with money left over. But the story gets even better because of that 5% annual increase clause. Last year, Karen's rent went up to $525 per month. I sent her the notice as required by the lease, and she actually tried to argue about it. She called my lawyer directly to complain that the increase was unfair and that she wanted to renegotiate the terms. My lawyer politely reminded her that she had signed a legally binding agreement and that the rent increase was clearly specified in the contract she had agreed to. He also mentioned that if she preferred, she could always choose to terminate the lease and remove the building. That ended the conversation pretty quickly. The funniest part is watching Karen's relationship with her own building change over time. In the beginning, she was out there constantly, arranging flowers in the window boxes and keeping everything perfect. She would spend hours in there working on her crafts, and you could see how proud she was of the space. Now I barely see her use it. She goes out there maybe once or twice a week, and it never looks like she is enjoying herself. I think the reality of paying me $525 every month to use her own building has taken all the joy out of it. Sometimes I catch her staring at it through her kitchen window with this expression that looks like she is trying to figure out how her life went so wrong. The building itself is still in perfect condition because the lease makes Karen responsible for all maintenance. She has to keep it painted, repair any damage, and maintain the landscaping around it. She also has to carry insurance on the structure and pay any property taxes associated with it. Basically, she has all the responsibilities of ownership with none of the rights. I have been keeping detailed records of every payment, partly because my accountant told me to, and partly because I just find the whole situation amusing. Over the past 2 years, Karen has paid me $12,600 to keep her building on my land. That is more than twice what I pay in annual property taxes for my entire property. The business she was planning to run from the building never really took off either. I think the stress of the legal situation and the ongoing expense killed her enthusiasm for the crafting venture. She had talked about selling handmade items online, but as far as I can tell, that never materialized into anything significant. So she is paying premium rent for what has essentially become the world's most expensive storage shed. My friends and family think the whole situation is hilarious. My brother jokes that I should become a professional property manager since I am apparently good at extracting rent from difficult tenants. My parents were initially worried that I was being too harsh, but when I explained the full story and showed them the survey documents, they agreed that Karen had brought this on herself. The legal precedent this created has been interesting too. My lawyer told me that he has had several other clients in similar situations reference this case when negotiating encroachment issues. Apparently, the combination of aggressive lease terms and automatic renewal clauses has become a popular strategy for dealing with property line violations. Karen tried to get around the situation once by having her husband approach me at the grocery store to ask if we could work out a different arrangement. He suggested that maybe they could just buy the strip of land outright instead of continuing to lease it. When I asked what they were thinking in terms of price, he mentioned a number that was laughably low. I explained that the land was not for sale at any price because I did not want to set a precedent of selling off pieces of my property to neighbors who decided to help themselves without asking. I also pointed out that even if I were willing to sell, the price would have to reflect the fact that the land now had a permanent structure on it, which would make it worth significantly more than raw land. He walked away looking defeated, and Karen avoided eye contact with me for months after that conversation. The city has been surprisingly supportive throughout this whole process. When Karen tried to complain to various departments about the situation, they consistently told her that it was a civil matter and that she needed to resolve it with me directly. The code enforcement officer who originally cited her for the violation has become friendly with me and occasionally asks how the situation is working out. He told me that my case has actually helped the city because it demonstrates that property line violations have real consequences. Apparently, they have had other situations where people built structures too close to boundaries, and in the past, it was difficult to get compliance because homeowners would just ignore the citations. Now they can point to Karen's situation as an example of what happens when you do not follow the rules. The one aspect of this that I did not anticipate was how it would affect Karen's relationship with other neighbors. Word got around about what happened, and Karen's reputation in the neighborhood took a serious hit. People started seeing her as someone who would take advantage of a neighbor's absence to grab land that did not belong to her. Several neighbors have mentioned to me that they appreciate how I handled the situation because it sent a message that property rights matter. One neighbor told me that Karen had made comments about his fence possibly being over the line, but after my situation, she suddenly stopped bringing it up. Karen and her husband tried to sell their house about 6 months ago, but the sale fell through. I suspect the lease agreement on my property created complications during the buyer's inspection process. Having a structure that requires ongoing rental payments to a neighbor is not exactly a selling point for most people. The real estate agent handling the sale actually contacted my lawyer to ask about the possibility of transferring the lease to new owners or buying out the remaining term. We declined both options. The lease specifically states that it is non-transferable and that any new property owners would need to negotiate their own agreement with me. I am sure that killed the deal because no reasonable buyer would want to inherit a situation where they have to pay $525 per month to use part of a building on their own property. Karen and her husband ended up taking the house off the market and staying put. The insurance situation has been another ongoing headache for Karen. Her homeowner's insurance company initially tried to deny coverage for the building because it sits partially on someone else's property. She had to get special liability coverage and pay higher premiums because of the unusual circumstances. Every year when her policy renews, she has to explain the situation again and provide updated lease documentation. My insurance company, on the other hand, loves the arrangement. They see it as reducing my liability since Karen is contractually responsible for any damages or issues related to the structure. My premiums actually went down slightly because of the comprehensive indemnification clause in the lease agreement. The tax implications have been interesting too. I have to report the rental income on my tax returns, but I can also deduct expenses related to managing the property. My accountant set up a separate category for tracking everything related to the lease, and it has actually worked out well from a tax perspective. Karen, meanwhile, cannot deduct the rent payments because they are not for her primary residence or a legitimate business property. She is just paying rent to use land she does not own for a building that was supposed to save her money in the long run. The irony is pretty thick. Looking back, I think Karen's biggest mistake was not taking the situation seriously when I first approached her about it. If she had been willing to work with me from the beginning, we probably could have found a reasonable solution that worked for everyone. Maybe she could have moved the building a few feet, or we could have worked out a modest payment arrangement. But her attitude that I should just accept her taking my land because it was only a few inches of grass that I did not use anyway made it impossible to have a reasonable conversation. She turned what could have been a neighborly misunderstanding into a legal battle that she was never going to win. The surveyor pins that started this whole thing are still there, now surrounded by nice bright markers that my surveyor installed. I keep them maintained and visible as a reminder to everyone about where the property lines actually are. They serve as a useful deterrent to prevent future encroachment issues. I have also had my entire property resurveyed and documented with the county records office. The new survey includes detailed measurements and GPS coordinates for every corner and boundary marker. If anyone else decides to build something near my property line, there will be no ambiguity about where they can and cannot build. The neighborhood kids find the whole situation entertaining. They have started referring to Karen's building as the rent house, and I've overheard them talking about how she has to pay OP to keep her own shed. Kids have a way of cutting through complicated situations to get to the heart of what is really happening. My property value is probably increased because of this situation too. Having a guaranteed rental income stream, even a small one, adds to the overall worth of the property. If I ever decide to sell, I can market the house as having an existing tenant paying above market rent for premium land. Karen's property value has almost certainly decreased because of the ongoing lease obligation and the complications it creates for future sales. Any potential buyer would have to factor in the monthly rent payments and the risk that I might choose not to renew the lease at some point. The lease comes up for its first renewal period next year, and I have been thinking about whether to make any changes to the terms. I could increase the rent beyond the 5% annual escalation, or I could add additional restrictions on the use of the building. But honestly, the current arrangement is working so well that I will probably just let it continue as is. Next month marks the beginning of year 3, which means Karen's rent is going up again. This time it will be $551.25 per month. The extra 26 cents might not sound like much, but over the course of a year, it adds up to more than $300 in additional rent. I plan to send Karen the required notice about the increase right on schedule. The lease requires 60 days advance notice, and I always send it certified mail so there's no question about when she received it. Her reaction to these notices has become less dramatic over time, but I can tell she still hates getting them. The math really drives home how badly this situation backfired on Karen. My annual property taxes for my entire house and lot are $5,900. Karen's rent for that 75 square foot patch of grass is now $6,300 per year. Her expensive mistake is not only paying my property taxes, but also covering the cost of a nice vacation every year. By the end of year 3, Karen will have paid me more than $19,000 to keep her building on my land. That is probably more than the building cost to construct in the first place. She essentially financed my property taxes for 3 years while getting nothing in return except the privilege of using her own property. The building still looks nice, and Karen maintains it well because the lease requires it. But I think every time she walks past it or has to write me another rent check, she is reminded of how a simple conversation about boundaries turned into years of monthly payments to the neighbor she tried to take advantage of. Her cute little studio, which she built by stealing my land, now pays my entire annual property tax bill with money left over for a nice dinner out every month. She thought she was being clever by taking land I was not using anyway, but instead she ended up paying me to live next door to her. And the best part is, her rent is due for another 5% increase in just a few weeks. The next one is a malicious compliance story. Back in the early 2000s, I was a concrete mixer driver. Mostly I drove a front mixer, which means the high end of the barrel and the opening is in the front, because the driver has so much control over the concrete pouring operation. While I pour, I can start and stop, control the flow. I sit rather high, so I can better see the job site. I can also easily move the truck while pouring, and I can hydraulically move the chute left, right, up/down, so they are more desired, mostly because the crew receiving the load can use less people than with a cheaper rear truck. Keep in mind the concrete load is batched in the plant and loaded in the truck straight away for delivery. As the ingredients start to harden, the mix heats up. The longer the mix is in the truck, the more the concrete heats up and starts to set. 2 ways to slow this down is to slow the rotation to the slowest speed, reducing friction, and add water to cool the load. Typically, you want to pour the load within an hour of being batched. One day, I poured a job and ended up with about 4 cubic yards of concrete left over. Normally, I would take this back to the yard and pour it in large block forms to make large 1 cubic yard interlocking blocks to be sold for retaining walls. However, this day there was a contractor close by where I was that needed a little more concrete to finish a basement floor in a new construction home. Great thanks, dispatch. We have a truck not too far away from you with extra concrete that we will sell you at a discount. Contractor agrees because it saves him money and he does not have to wait. So, I head there. Once on site, I set up really quick, check my load, and add water as needed to get a good flow. I pour for a little bit and the contractor asks for more water. Here's the thing, my load is over 2 hours old right now and it is heating up fast. It needs more water, more often, to remain fluid. The water evaporates out quickly and the concrete gets thicker. Each of our trucks carry 300 gallons of water used for the concrete and cleaning the truck when done. Under the water tank there is a main shutoff valve. Below that is a pipe that runs to the cab, with another valve, then up to the barrel to water the load. 2 more valves for the upper and lower water hoses, and 1 more for a drain to the ground. All these except for the barrel valve are located outside the truck behind the cab. The contractor gets angry that I have to stop often to add water. Remember, the load is old by concrete standards. As a concrete contractor, he should know that. He comes up to me and says, "Open the barrel valve and add water." Nowhere near that nice. Then he says, "Do not touch that valve again. Leave it open and I will control the water." Again, nowhere near that nice. Now mix that up and start pouring. What he is doing is shutting off the main valve from the outside when he decides there is enough water. Malicious compliance. He comes out 2 more times and adds water. Finally, as they get close to being done, some of the extra guys on the crew come up, open the main valve, grab my hose, and start washing their tools. Because they open the main valve, they are also adding water to the barrel. Now I am not to touch the barrel valve, so I don't say a word, I don't touch the valve. The barrel line dumps 1 gallon of water per second. Just over a minute later, about 70 gallons of water rush down the chute and in the basement. The contractor comes out of the basement screaming, comes up to me and he says, "What is your problem?" I said, "I don't have a problem. The problem is you thought you could do my job and yours and you can't. Now you have a problem." As I finished cleaning the truck, he was calling every number for my company to complain. When I got back to the yard, the plant manager wanted to know what happened. After I explained the situation, I found out the company as a whole has had an issue with this contractor. I never heard anything about it, nor did I ever see that contractor again. The next one is an entitled people story. Everyone in this post are over age 30. I am engaged to my fiancé. I am Asian and he's white. In my culture, we have what's called a bride price. It's an agreed upon, by both parties, amount of money the groom pays to the bride's parents or a sibling if parents are deceased. In my culture, our weddings last 2 days and it's long and tedious, so I've made it clear to my fiancé from the beginning that we'd be having an American wedding instead, and he's fine with it. My sister thinks we are having a wedding in my culture, despite me telling her at least twice in the past it'll be an American wedding. Long background short, all my many siblings basically left the burden of taking care of our parents onto not too long after I finished high school. My dad has passed for over a decade now, so it's just been my mom and me. They neither extended a helping hand nor barely helped even when my mom asked them for just errands for her and always deferred it back to me. Even when my elderly mom had a stroke and needed 24/7 care, I told them I will need help. They all say they'll help but don't. Even my brother, who lived with us at the time, barely helped. My mom is in a nursing home now getting proper care as she also developed dementia after her stroke. My mom, of course, cannot handle fiancés. My sister messaged me the other day and wedding planning came up, and she mentioned the wedding in my culture since fiancé and I haven't really planned anything as a wedding is not priority. I told her I won't be having a wedding in my culture because none of my siblings deserves the money. She told me she deserves the money because she helped take care of me when I was younger. 8-year age gap between us. Spoiler, she got married not too long after finishing high school and moved out of state to live with her husband, so she literally only helped my parents babysit me here and there until maybe I was 10 or not even 10, y'all. My brain stalled and I could not think of where the audacity came from, and every time I think of it, I still can't wrap my mind around the entitlement, so now wedding plans changed and she is no longer invited and won't know any of my plans either. Anyway, thank you for watching.